done from the American soil within that context to find our way around. The book is available, will be outside, and I hope that you like it. And if you don't, let us know also, because this itself is enriching. Thank you very much. Salam. The first copy of the book will go as a gift from MPAC to Constance Rice.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. This panel has been constructed to really look at the various foreign policy aspects and what role Muslim Americans have to contribute in terms of America's interests abroad. But if you think about it, this is really a panel that deals with domestic policy, because it is only through the inclusion of Muslim Americans in the policy-making apparatus that people will find the treasures and the contributions and the support and the bridges between the United States and the Muslim world, and between the United States and practically all parts of the world. So we feel that the foreign and domestic policies, especially in the post-9/11 era, are interdependent. So there is no set of categories that is only foreign policy. What happens here affects what happens abroad. What is happening abroad definitely has an impact on the psychological and social makeup and dynamics of our country here. So that is why we decided to have this panel as part of examining our role in America. We believe that Muslims have a role in America, and there will be no good relationship with the Muslim world without an active, integrated role of Muslim Americans. So we have three individuals, three experts that can begin giving us an idea of the landscape in terms of foreign policy and the role of Muslim Americans. And then we would like to have you come and ask very brief questions. And you will have an opportunity to interact with this panel, and they will have an opportunity to interact with each other as well. So I would like to introduce our first expert. He is an associate professor of modern Middle Eastern history, culture, and Islamic studies at the University of California, Irvine, as well as the author of a half a dozen books and Grammy Award winner for his work with Muslim and American hip-hop and metal artists. His book, Why They Don't Hate Us, Lifting the Veil on the Axis of Evil, is a must-read for all of us, and you can get that on Amazon.com right now. He co-directs an innovative program bringing Israeli and Palestinian scholars together to imagine new ways to approach their country's history and current trouble. Please welcome Professor Mark LeVine.
Yeah. Go over there. Oh, boy. Shukran Kathir for that wonderful introduction. Sometimes I'm not sure where everyone gets these introductions, but at least this time most of what was said was fairly accurate and true in a good sense. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been following the work of MPAC since its inception, I think, and I've known Salam's work and the work of other people associated with it, and I think it's very encouraging and very important that we all come together, not just Muslims, but when Muslims or Jews or Christians or Hindus are coming together, that we bring together others from other faiths who share a similar commitment to truth, to social justice, to fighting for democracy and freedom, and who are willing to look critically at their own traditions at the same time that they're happy to look, or they feel it's important to look critically at other people's traditions. For me, when Salam asked me last time we were together to give a talk about these issues, the two things that popped into my head were education and activism. And I think these are the two most important things that Muslims in America or around the world can contribute to changing American culture and America's perception of the Muslim world. Because I think that part of the reason that the policies, as the Defense Department Science Review Board put it, Muslims don't hate America. They don't hate what America stands for. What they hate are many of America's policies. And I think the key to actually changing these policies is through Muslim Americans who have a much more intimate knowledge of these policies, actually working to educate the rest of Americans so that there's not this incredible discontinuity that I experience every time I travel in the Muslim world, in the Middle East or North Africa, and I'm sure many of you see it, where in America people don't understand why so many people are opposed to our policies, and in the Muslim world people don't understand why Americans don't understand why they're so opposed to so many of our policies. And let me just give, I think, two examples that, for me, one fairly old, I'm a historian, so I think it's important to reach back into history, and another much more recent that together show the problem in America's self-perception about our role in the Muslim world. The first one comes from a line that was written by George F. Kennan, famous State Department official in 1948, right at the birth of the Cold War, when that period's New World Order was being put together. And he said, Americans control half the world's wealth, but we only have 6.3% of the world's population. And our real task in the coming period is to maintain this position of disparity. Now, for all the good that was done during the Cold War and the fights for freedom and democracy that America helped sponsor, especially when it came to the Middle East, those words have rarely not rang true. And I think that even President Bush admitted this when he said, look, for 60 years America has put, the United States has put our economic or our strategic interest ahead of democracy, and look where it's gotten us. So there's a realization I think we need to laud the Bush administration for actually owning up to the problems with the policies of past administrations, really going back to the beginning of the United States involvement in the Middle East, when President Roosevelt sat on a destroyer with King Saud of Saudi Arabia and guaranteed or put in place the system where, as long as America maintained geostrategic control of the Middle East and access to, we all know which resource, oil, that the regimes that helped make this happen would be supported and maintained in power. Now, more recently, one could argue that this has changed, but sadly, in many ways, this is still the situation today. I don't know how many of you traveled through Iraq, as I have since the invasion and occupation, but one of the questions I heard from so many Iraqis, and I hear this all the time throughout the world, the Muslim world, is you have great policies, you have great ideals, but why don't you walk the talk more? And this was most poignantly put to me when I was in Baghdad last year, sitting with an elderly Iraqi lawyer whose son was killed by the U.S. Army, and he said, look, he quoted me Franklin and Jefferson and other people, other of the founding fathers, and asked me if he was correct that those were their words, and I had to admit that I wasn't sure because I haven't read them in a long time, but they sounded like their words. And he said, well, if these are your words and these are your ideals, what's going on? Right? What's going on here? What's going on in Iraq? And when I go to Morocco, or when I was in Beirut a month and a half ago, I constantly get the same question. How is it that we're not walking the talk, and what can Americans do to get not just our government to walk the talk, but in so doing, get the governments in the region and our allies in Europe and elsewhere to walk the talk of actually supporting democracy, freedom, and real peace with justice across the Muslim world. So in order to do this, though, I think we all need to have a better understanding of what the history of the region is and our involvement in it. This is not the place to rehash it. I talk about it in the book, and most of you here probably don't need that kind of education. But the one thing I will say that's very interesting and sadly telling for me is that most Muslims around the world know the history of America's foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, much better than most Americans. So I think one of the tools, the most important tools at the disposal of the Muslim American community is to help educate Americans about our own history and about the ramifications of our history and about why that history would lead to a situation where, as our own government admits, so many people around the world are so upset with our policies. This is, after all, a democracy, and Americans, the only way we can make have observed consent to the policies that our government are making on our behalf or are enacting on our behalf is if we actually understand not only the present reality, but the historical reality. So this, I think, is very important, and I think Muslims are uniquely positioned in America to do that. The second thing that I think is important is activism. And here, I think this ties into the way the threats and the challenge to Muslims, not only by our own government, but around the world, who criticize either US policies or policies of their own governments. Today, we have a major problem. And the problem is that the mainstream politics and mainstream activism define moderate, and this is, of course, the goal, to have moderate Muslims and support a moderate Islam. But it defines these goals in such a way that it's very hard to understand how the moderates we are discussing actually can help bring about the actual radical change that everyone agrees is necessary. So when we have leaders, whether it's politicians or pundits, talking about moderate politicians such as General Musharraf, or even the King of Jordan, or other people who are moderate towards our policies, but towards their own people, in many ways one would have to question using the word moderate to describe them. This is not helpful. And what I've grown to learn is that what we really need are more radicals. And I know this is not necessarily the best thing to be saying, that the Muslim world needs more radicals, or that America needs more radicals, because that's certainly saying that can get you unpleasant visits or phone calls or who knows what else these days. But yet, it's absolutely crucial, more than ever today, to put this forward. Because in fact, the change that everyone, I assume, in this room wants to bring about, real democratization, real peace, a real transformation in the nature of globalization, in the nature of the global economy, the nature of global culture, to actually support sustainable development, whether it's in New Orleans, and Reza is from New Orleans, and I'm sure he can see the links between what happened with Hurricane Katrina and what's happened around the world much better than I can say, much better than I can describe them. But if we want these changes, these are actually radical changes. And we need people who are really willing to think radically. The problem is that for so many people who do that, they get oppressed or jailed or threatened or exiled in their own countries. Our own government, like sadly with the case of Tariq Ramadan, either puts obstacles in their way or won't even let them come here to teach and help spread a message of peace and democracy, even though, and I'll just say this about Professor Ramadan, because I know him and have spoken with him. I actually gave a lecture to senior CIA and State Department staff a couple of years ago about Professor Ramadan, and I was told by them, he's the real deal, he's great. How can we find more people like him? Right? And then we all know what happened since then, when he was blocked from coming to teach at the US because of supposed ties to radical regimes. Well, this is a radical Islam, quote unquote. Well, these are the kind of things that we all need to be educated about, so we can help to demand that our government allow the kind of people who are actually pushing for real, radical, democratic change across the Muslim world can come and speak to us. Other radicals, if we go to Morocco, if we go to Beirut, where I just was recently, if we go to Israel, Palestine, if we go to Pakistan, there are radicals everywhere who are radical in a good sense. And Americans need to learn about them. And I think one thing that Muslims can do that can help bring is to show Americans what these radicals are and how important it is to support people who want radical change in the region using peace, pushing real democracy, real progressive politics, a real redistribution of wealth, because one thing about the Middle East that most Americans don't understand is how a region that's so rich can still be in so many ways so poor. And this is something, since most of the people in this room, I'm sure, were born in the region or travel to the region, can help people understand this is not just about cruel despots, right, hoarding all the money and keeping their peoples poor. This is a much larger dynamic. This is a systemic issue. This is an issue that involves not just the Muslim world, but involves America, it involves US policy, it involves the policies of European governments, that it's all of us together who have gotten the Muslim world into the mess that so much of it is in. And that all the progressive, radical, democratic Muslims in the world working as hard as they can together will not be able to make the changes that we all want unless the rest of us help them and help you do that. So activism, becoming more active in the kinds of organizations, whether they're political organizations, whether they're local libraries, whether they're local organizations dealing with just foreign policy or anything that brings Americans into contact with the rest of the world. I think Muslims need to become more involved. I know everyone in this room, of course, already is involved in that, but I think we need to become more involved together. We need to educate people. We need to become more active. We need to be willing to challenge the status quo and to support each other when we do that, because today challenging the status quo is much more troubling and can be much more dangerous to us than it was in the past. So we need to be strong. We need to support each other. And finally, I think the most very important thing for me is traveling to the region. You know, just an example in Iraq again, because it's so poignant and so telling today. I thought I knew a lot about Iraq before I went, because I studied the region, I knew the language. When I got to Iraq and actually traveled around, only then did I realize how little I knew, and how little most of the people writing about Iraq, especially those who thought they knew what they were talking about, actually knew, right? Which is even more troubling. And the more Americans can visit the Muslim world, and I'm not suggesting that Americans should be running off to Iraq right now, although I think that in the months after the invasion, before the insurgency took off, it would have done a lot of good if a lot more Americans could have been there, not as part of the occupation, but there to build a real democratic future. But certainly, more Americans need to go and see the region as it really is, to learn how complex it is, to learn that Muslims don't hate us, right? That even if they hate U.S. policies or have lots of problems with our position in the world, they want to engage our ideals and work with anyone who will help them, not fight against them the way a very small minority of Muslims around the world want to do. And if we can bring more Americans to the region, if we can educate them, if we can force our own politicians to acknowledge the disparity between our rhetoric and our continuing policies, both the history and the continuing policies, I think we're going to go a long way to actually changing the political climate in the United States, and go a long way towards actually supporting the movements, the myriad movements across the Middle East who are desperately looking for allies to push for real, democratic, peaceful change and development in the countries that are our biggest allies, and therefore find our policies the biggest obstruction to achieving that very development we say we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that very enriching presentation, and we're going to look forward to the question and answer period for interaction on these and many other topics. In the spirit of nonpartisanship and enriched debate, we at MPAC have decided to invite people of different persuasions and, practically speaking and frankly speaking, people taking different policy positions. Our next speaker represents the United States State Department, who will definitely bring a different perspective from what we previously have just heard. But before I introduce her, I just want to say something about the good thing that is happening in our country right now. Yes, there is a lot of anti-Islamic rhetoric. Yes, there is a lot of stereotyping about Islam and hostility towards Islam and Muslims. But for an organization like MPAC, who works in Washington, there are many allies of goodwill and people who want to promote the truth and people who want to come to a resolution to these kinds of problems, both here and abroad. We have friends in the U.S. government. We have friends in law enforcement in the Department of Justice, and I see Mike Rollins is here, and Norma Loza from the local FBI office in Los Angeles. They are an example of allies that are trying to bring people together. There are those that are trying to take us apart. Recently, an article was written about this convention in some ragtag publication out of New York City. And it was saying that another extremist group is holding a conference and inviting Justice Department and the State Department, and how dare they come speak to these extremist groups. This is character assassination against a legitimate community in America, the Muslim American community. And it will take our work to bring our issues to the forefront, not not just for the interest of Muslim Americans, but for the interest of America at large. We cannot do that without people like our next speaker, who tell these publications that they are wrong, that the mainstream Muslim American community needs to be heard, and that we will embrace each other on common ground, and we will respectfully disagree on other areas. This is the spirit of America that we want and that we feel is in the best interest of our country. So please welcome our next speaker, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. In this capacity, she oversees department-sponsored educational and professional exchange programs. She came to the Department of State in June 2003 to establish a new office to oversee and manage the President's Middle East Partnership Initiative, and served as its director. During that time period, she also served for 9 months as acting Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. She attended Tel Aviv University in Israel to pursue postgraduate work in Middle East studies and learned Hebrew. She speaks French and has studied Arabic and Hebrew. Please welcome the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Educational Cultural Affairs, Alina Romanowski.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here to address this annual convention for a couple of reasons. One, I left this morning from Washington. It was really cold, so it's nice to be out here in a little warmer climate. But also, for most of my government career, which now spans almost 25 years, where I've been working on the Middle East, most of my speaking has been in the Middle East to governments and to people, trying to explain, convince them, and of our government's policies. So for me, coming out to America and speaking about our policies to Americans is also now a new part of my career, and it's a real pleasure for me to do that. I'm also looking, again, the theme of your convention is, I think, a very important one for us at the State Department, and particularly for my boss, my two bosses, Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy Karen Hughes and Assistant Secretary for Education and Cultural Affairs Dina Powell, who really do want to take a very different approach to public diplomacy, and largely because of much of what the President has directed, and that's going to be part of what I'm going to speak to you about. So I will be very interested in hearing from you during the question and answer period about your thoughts about how the community can engage with their own government, but also the kind of things that you are thinking about in terms of a more international approach that you're taking. So again, for that reason, I am very pleased to come all the way out here and speak to you. So let me start by, to begin with a few comments about the events unfolding in Iraq and the Middle East over the last several days. The next thing I'd like to do is explain some of the ways we understand and define public diplomacy. And I finally will focus briefly on how we are employing the tools of public diplomacy to advance the American agenda of democracy and freedom in the Middle East. For the third time this year, just on Thursday, the world witnessed the extraordinary and heartening spectacle of the Iraqi people defying violence and intimidation to take their future into their own hands. An overwhelming number of eligible Iraqi voters, and much larger than the turnout in January, went to the polls on Thursday. And through their actions, they were establishing something vitally unprecedented, or virtually unprecedented, in the Middle East, and that is a functioning democracy. But Iraqis are also doing more. They are helping to inspire an entire region where the drama of the democratic struggle is being played out in a very different, yes, yet unmistakable ways, whether we're talking about Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, or the Palestinian territories. Moreover, however halting or imperfect this democratic advance it will be inevitable and inexorably shift the ground from under the purveyors of violence and terrorism. Speaking of murdered Lebanese journalist Gibran Tueni, the Washington Post columnist David Ignatius, and I hope some of you do read the Washington Post out here, reminds us that we must never forget what is at stake here for Iraq, the Middle East, the United States, and the world. He said, "It's about breaking the power of assassins. Through their courage, Lebanese journalists and Iraqi voters," he writes, "are trying to break the culture of intimidation and death. And Americans," he concludes, "should feel proud to be at their side." Let me step back a moment from the events of the past week and look more broadly at the work of public diplomacy in advancing the cause of democracy and peace and fighting the virulent ideas and the hate speech of extremists. First, I think we need to understand what public diplomacy is and what it isn't. Public diplomacy is not public relations, it's not spin, it's not storytelling, it is a strategic imperative. The President recognized its vital importance when he asked one of his closest friends and advisor, Karen Hughes, to serve as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, as well as another one of his close advisors, and that is Dina Habib Powell, as his Assistant Secretary for Education and Cultural Affairs. And probably as important, these two officials have been charged by the President to coordinate the entire federal effort to improve relations with the peoples of other nations. The President also recognized that public diplomacy is the job for all of us, diplomat, soldier, government official, and private citizen, in virtually every area of international affairs every day, which is, of course, one of the reasons why I'm here to address your group. Let me be clear as to what exactly we're talking about. In the Middle East, we may have strong policy differences with some others over Iraq, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and the scope and shape of democracy building in the region. But these differences can be just that, policy disagreements among nations that share our basic values in individual freedom, religious tolerance, and the rule of law. But among those who ignore or reject these universal rights and freedoms, these same policy differences can become toxic and as deadly as car bombs on a Baghdad street or airplanes that fly into buildings on a day in September. Policy advocacy, of course, will always be a constant and highly visible element of public diplomacy. But the real work, I would argue, is largely institutional, often long-term, usually low-key, and sometimes hardly visible. To be effective, public diplomacy must be effectively linked to policy. It can't be an afterthought or an attempt at a PR gloss on events. The essence of public diplomacy is to link people and policy, to build institutional relationships, to send a clear and consistent message over time about our policies and the values that underlie them. Public diplomacy can actually give foreign policy legs, staying power, and endurance. It is also important to stress the time factor. Attitudes, ideas, beliefs are always complex, often ambivalent, and usually deeply held. When a mind opens, the shift can be imperceptible and take place at a glacial pace, especially in sharp contrast to our hyper-speed, image-saturated media world. But in the long run, these quiet changes in attitudes are really the ones that count. Here at home, that can mean listening to the distinguished foreign affairs experts, both inside and outside the government, including members of Congress, listening to the non-governmental organizations that do such terrific work overseas and in the United States, and other private sector representatives. It also means listening to engaged organizations like the Muslim Public Affairs Council and other leading members of the Arab and Muslim American communities. Abroad, clearly we meet with and consult with government representatives, of course, but all of us try to follow the example of our boss, Karen Hughes, who has invested substantial time in what she calls her listening tours to a number of the Muslim-majority nations. These listening tours serve another purpose, though. They are to demonstrate the principle that public diplomacy must be a dialogue, that we in this country are genuinely open and interested in the ideas and perceptions of others. And with a solid foundation of mutual understanding and shared values, we can learn from each other, enrich each other's lives, and join together in common cause. Out of these discussions, Undersecretary Hughes has set out 3 overarching strategic objectives for our public diplomacy. First, we must offer a positive vision to people throughout the world that is rooted in our unalterable commitment to freedom and democracy, to religious tolerance, and to the rule of law. We promote these rights not because we seek to impose our values on others, but because these are the universal rights of all people everywhere. We advocate these rights because they represent the core values of who we are as Americans, as individuals, and as a people. We recognize that the defense of these rights in the most profound way serves our own interests as well as those people everywhere. And the President said recently, by standing for the hope and freedom of others, we can make our own freedom more secure. Our second principle is to isolate and marginalize the extremists and expose their efforts to appropriate religion in the name of violence. Our message here, amplified by the peoples of every nationality and faith, must be plain and repetitive, that no injustice, no wrong, real or imagined, can ever justify the murder of innocent people. We cannot overstate the important role that members of organizations like MPAC can play in combating hatred and violence by defending the tenets of their faith. Our third strategic objective is to foster a community of common interests and shared values. Our forthright support for democratic reform and individual freedom is certainly one example, but there are many others, and they include faith, family, educational opportunity, and not to mention the fields of science, technology, culture, and arts. Let me now turn to the crucible where our public diplomacy faces one of its severest tests, and that is the Middle East. Without question, our policies generate controversy and opposition. Change is unsettling and controversial, and make no mistake, as my colleague Mark LeVine also said, the President has set the United States on a new course in the Middle East, one that replaced an essentially status quo policy with a dynamic policy based on democracy and freedom. And Secretary Rice in Cairo in June said that, in fact, for 60 years, our country, the United States, pursued stability at the expense of democracy in the region, and we achieved neither. Now we are taking a different course, and we are supporting the democratic aspirations of all peoples. Americans can't do everything, but acting in both confidence and humility, there is much that we can do. We can support democratic aspirations of people, we can lead by example, and we can help illuminate the road ahead. Ultimately, though, of course, the people of the Middle East must travel their own road towards freedom at their own pace and based on their own traditions and culture. And when we look around, that is exactly what we are seeing. Women have won the right to vote in Kuwait. Saudi Arabia has conducted municipal elections, albeit without the participation of women, but I think that's coming down the road. Egypt has held imperfect but landmark presidential and parliamentary elections, and the currents of democratic change are running through a varied nations as Morocco, Jordan, Qatar, and Bahrain. Democratic reform in the Palestinians' territories brought tangible hope of ending violence, resuming the progress on the roadmap to peace, and heading for a destination that President Bush has stated on numerous occasions, and for the first time in U.S. policy, that there should be two states living side by side in peace and security. In Lebanon, we've seen just a vivid example of people power, just as we did with the Orange and Rose revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia. The Lebanese people combined outrage, hope, and peaceful political protest to call for the ouster of Syrian military and intelligence forces. We joined in partnership with the French to lead the demand for the removal of Syrian forces from Lebanon and secured a unanimous Security Council resolution demanding full Syrian accountability for the killing of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, even as another courageous journalist just lost his life this week. And Afghanistan, while still battling persistent terrorist violence, has made incredible strides for democracy that I think are stunning by any measure with when you compare it to where it was under the Taliban and al-Qaeda. And again, I point to Iraq, which is no exception. At this week's elections remind us again, the news from Baghdad is more than the sum total of suicide and roadside bombs. The day of government rule by assassination and terror is passing, no matter how slow and painful the process is. And as we look to the days after and months after the election, the Iraqis are still going to find challenges to building their democracy and establishing security in Iraq. I said earlier that public diplomacy is not a popularity contest. It doesn't mean that we regard public opinion as irrelevant. In fact, words do count, so do perceptions and beliefs. We must never forget that this nation began with a public declaration to the world, and Thomas Jefferson's admonition that we owe a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. I'm going to resist now, as I close, to providing you with a lengthy list of old and new programs that we're implementing in the Middle East and elsewhere. For those of you who are really interested, I refer you to the State Department website. But I would like to highlight a couple of areas specifically of my work as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in Professional and Cultural Exchanges. We know that from a long experience of over 50 years, that exchange programs remain one of our most powerful and effective public diplomacy tools. Americans who go overseas describe their lives being changed forever, and likewise, people who come here have the opportunity to learn for themselves that Americans are generous, hardworking people who value family and faith. Simply put, these exchanges are transformational and they work. So we are examining ways of expanding our exchange programs. But more importantly, we are implementing a strategy in the Middle East and elsewhere that focuses on key groups that are influential within their own societies and vital as well to our interests. And among them are the religious leaders and scholars, teachers who reach out to the younger generation, as well as journalists. Just last Tuesday, Secretary Rice announced the Edward R. Murrow Journalism Program. It's a new program in partnership with the Aspen Institute and 6 renowned American journalism schools that are going to bring this year 100 foreign journalists from around the world to the United States for an experience in job shadowing in our media outlets across the United States and to study journalism at these universities. We're also seeking innovative ways of engaging the private sector as well in our exchange efforts, going back to my points about how we're all part of public diplomacy. In November, we launched the Fortune State Department International Women's Leaders Mentorship Program. And this will match emerging women in business from around the world with Fortune's most powerful women in business for a 3-week internship program in the United States. I'm sure all of us would like to have an experience with some of them, I'm sure. But we're also speaking to empower the voices of America's best natural resources, and that's the private citizens. And one venue is the Citizen Ambassador Program. On their listening tour to the Middle East and Turkey, Karen Hughes and Dina Powell brought along 2 of such citizen ambassadors. We recognize that the voices of government officials are not always the most powerful or the most credible. And we are exploring ways in which we can both broaden and institutionalize this effort to identify seemingly ordinary people who do extraordinary things in our country and bring them into a diverse range of exchange activities as citizen ambassadors. These public-private efforts always have a huge multiplier effect when we can harness the energy and the commitment of citizens, corporations, and non-governmental organizations. And I hope that we can explore ways in which we can link our exchange programs and other public diplomacy programs to the work of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Because for over 17 years, MPAC has been providing leadership to the Muslim American community. Your works in civil rights have strived to help the community ensure your rights are not threatened or violated. And also through your relationship with other Muslims worldwide and through international media outlets, you have been engaged in combating ignorance about Islam, explaining Muslim life in America, and countering terrorism and extremism. Your national anti-terrorism campaign and your work in interfaith dialogue has also been a valuable asset to America in bridging understanding and rapprochement between the United States and the Muslim world. Muslim Americans have done much, and I think can do a lot more. In fact, you often have more credibility in the Muslim world as members of the Islamic faith who can speak to the experience of balancing religion, social and political participation, and modernity every day. And so I look forward again to hearing some of the ideas for cooperation after I speak and also in a subsequent panel discussion. So let me, in conclusion, I am reminded of a recent editorial article that Secretary Rice wrote, where she said, "Our statecraft must now be guided by the undeniable truth that democracy is the only assurance of lasting peace and security between states, because it is the only guarantee of freedom and justice within states." In terms of public diplomacy, I don't know how popular that statement might be right now in the Middle East, but we do know that that is the right policy. To impose our values and practices on others may be futile and in fact foolhardy, but to stand for freedom and reform and democracy in the world is the mandate of our time in the Middle East, no less than anywhere else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Romanowski. Again, we are looking forward to your participation, so in about 10 minutes you will have a chance to ask questions to our panelists, and they will also have a chance to interact with each other and discuss these different points of views. Our next speaker earned a Bachelor of Arts in Religion from Santa Clara University, a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard University, a Master of Fine Arts in Fiction from the University of Iowa, and is currently a doctoral candidate in History of Religions at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He has served as a legislative assistant for the Friends Committee on National Legislation in Washington, D.C. He has written for the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Slate, Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and The Nation, and has appeared on Meet the Press, Hardball, The Daily Show, and Nightline. He is author of his recent book, No God But God. He was born in Iran, and he now lives in Santa Monica and New Orleans. Please welcome Reza Aslan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and blessings and mercy of God be upon all of you. Thank you so much for having me here. I want to thank especially my fellow panelists, especially Mark, for making sure that for the first time I am not the one with the longest hair on a panel. That's never happened before, and I'm grateful. And I also would like to welcome all of you and thank all of you for being here today in such large numbers. And I think this is a really exciting time for us, and this is going to be a wonderful chance for us to dialogue with one another. And I'm going to keep my comments as short as possible so that we do have an opportunity to exchange thoughts. But I'd like to welcome all of you, both our Muslim brothers and sisters and the media and friends who are here, any members of Homeland Security that may be out there. And thank you all for coming. Our president has told us that we are engaged in a war of ideology, and he's absolutely correct. The problem is that a war of ideology cannot be defeated solely with bombs and guns. On the contrary, a war of ideology, any method to defeat an ideology of bigotry and fanaticism and hatred and exclusivism and militant puritanism, the only way to defeat such an ideology is with an ideology of tolerance and love and pluralism and peace. And the only people who are qualified to create that ideology are Muslims. Now, on the one hand, I think that is an exciting and wonderful and beautiful thing because it puts an enormous amount of responsibility in our hands, and it gives us an opportunity to make our voices heard in a way that they have never been heard. On the other hand, it's a lot of pressure, and quite frankly, who wants it? Who needs it? I mean, I could understand why so many of us, the 1.2 billion Muslims around the world who are minding their own business, living their own lives, going to mosque, trying to raise their children in the right way, trying to reconcile their values with the realities of the modern world, and would quite frankly not want to be a part of a war of ideology. And that's understandable. The reason I think that American Muslim community has really no way of avoiding this kind of responsibility is that we have something that our brothers and sisters throughout the Arab and Muslim worlds do not have, and that is a voice and an opportunity to make sure that that voice gets injected in the public dialogue about not just domestic policy, but foreign policy. And that is what's so astounding and miraculous about the country that we live in. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that the voice of the American Muslim community is a part of the dialogue about not just where this country is going domestically, and we've heard enough about that, and we will hear more about that, about how important it is to recognize that American values are Muslim values, and that we have a very large and very powerful role to play in the future, the future makeup of this wonderful country. But also, I think more importantly right now, we have a responsibility to make sure that our voice is injected in the issues of foreign policy, which are so important, and particularly with regard to public diplomacy. This, I think, is a very important thing, and I would very, very much like to thank Deputy Assistant Secretary Romanowski for sharing with us the vision of the State Department in trying to make American public diplomacy to the Muslim world such a priority, and it is an incredible priority. The only problem, I think, with that is that if our American foreign policy, if our public diplomacy program has as its primary goal the idea of making American foreign policy more palatable to the people of the Muslim world, then it is a waste of time. It is bound to fail from the start. That is not a criticism about American foreign policy, but it's the reality of how American foreign policy is seen in large parts of the Arab and Muslim worlds. If, on the other hand, the role of American public diplomacy is to communicate American values, American traditions, American morals, what it means to be American, then that is a public diplomacy that has a wonderful chance of making a real change in the world. But here is the issue. Who better to define, to communicate to the Muslim world what it means to be American than American Muslims? It is our responsibility because we, in who we are, in our very identities, we are the embodiment of the reconciliation, the merging of American and Muslim values. And as such, we are living examples of this. And we have to make sure that our identities, our needs, our desires are being met. We have to, like in any democracy, demand that those needs and desires and those values are being met. I mean, it is very important, and I congratulate the work that Karen Hughes has been doing so far, and particularly with regard to the listening tour that she has been on. But of course, to truly listen to a people, you have to be able to speak their language. You have to be able to know how to understand what it is that they are saying, what it is that they are struggling with. And I think that we need a much larger role for American Muslims as advisory councils, as ambassadorial councils, with making sure that this voice of America is, to the Muslim world, is a voice that is being primarily shaped by American Muslims. The other issue, I think, with regard to the role of American Muslims in U.S. Muslim world relations, of course, is our foreign policy. Now, we can talk all day, of course, about our different views with regard to our foreign policy, and of course it would be impossible to talk about this subject without bringing up Iraq. This will probably get me into some trouble, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it anyway. We can talk on and on and on about whether the war in Iraq was just or unjust, whether it has been handled ineptly or not, whether we have created a situation in which we are now less secure than we were before, whether today's Iraq is better than it was before. This dialogue is irrelevant. It was important at one time, but it's just not anymore. We are in the middle of an excruciating and horrifying war, one in which we have had many, many American lives lost and coalition lives lost, but we have had hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who have died as a result of the violence in this country. What we need to do, I think, as American Muslims, and I'm just going to throw this little time bomb out there and then I'm going to sit down. What I think we need to do as American Muslims is learn a very valuable lesson from our Jewish brothers and sisters. 50 years ago in this country, Jewish Americans were a pariah. They were foreign, they were exotic, they were not a part of American society. They were seen much the same way that I think Muslim Americans are seen nowadays. And what our Jewish brothers and sisters did is that they coalesced, they unified, they reveled in their diversity, but they found unity in their diversity. And they made absolutely sure that their voice, that their values and their interests could not be ignored by their government. And as they multiplied and as they became fruitful and as they became a part of the very fabric of this country, that idea of Jews as being foreign or exotic or un-American has completely washed away. Now, the American Muslim community, according to most estimates, now outnumbers American Jews as the largest religious minority in the United States. We need to come together as our Jewish brothers and sisters did. And we need to recognize that our voices, our values, our interests can no longer be ignored, either in domestic affairs or in foreign policy affairs. And here is a thought. Here is a radical, radical thought. Why do we not make Iraq our Israel? Why do we not come together, put aside our various political agendas, our various ideas about whether the war was just or unjust, our different notions about what this overall so-called war on terror is about, or even this notion of the democratizing of the Middle East. Let's put that aside for a minute. Let's see what would happen if we come together and we agree on one thing and one thing only, and that is that it is impossible, it is absolutely impossible for the United States to win the war on terror without the help of Muslim Americans. And what that help means is that we have to recognize that there is good to be found in what is taking place in the conflicts in the Middle East and in Iraq. And that a stable, viable, democratic, indigenous democracy in Iraq, and Iraq for Iraqis, is good not just for all Muslims, but for all peoples of the world. And if we, just imagine, if we did that, if we said that we were going to make Iraq, despite the problems, despite the issues that are involved, the very thorny issues that are involved in this war, that we were going to make Iraq the shining light, the opportunity for American Muslims to come together and say, we are going to save this country. We are going to make sure that what comes out of here is good for everyone, and especially for Iraqis. Imagine the kind of power that we would have as Muslims in this country. We cannot allow our voices to be ignored, but there's only one way to do that, and that is to come together, to accept our diversity, to revel in our diversity, because that's what makes us Americans, is our diversity, but also to find unity in that diversity, to be one as God is one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is now time for your turn to come up and ask questions. We ask that your questions be limited to 30 seconds. That means it's a very brief and succinct question so that we can pool the whole audience. What we will have are two people with microphones in this column here. Amin, over here. And one here. Yeah, right there. And you just go ahead and form a line. Before we do that, I want to offer an opportunity for our panelists to respond or add to some of the comments that have been made. We'll start with Mark.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the discussions were very enlightening for me. I think what Reza talks about, coming together and pushing I call it an axis of empathy. And I think an axis of empathy is exactly what needs to be done, and certainly Islam, with its traditions, has a very important role to play in that, as does Judaism or Christianity, if all of us look to the best part of our own traditions instead of the more violent parts. But I think in order to do that, the first thing we need to understand is that today the guiding force in world affairs, and especially in the relations on both sides between the Muslim world and the United States or the West more broadly, is not just the axis of evil, not terrorism, but what we could call an axis of arrogance and ignorance on both sides. And I've seen it in so many places, wherever I've traveled, whether it's speaking in the US or around the Muslim world. So I think, again, I'd reiterate that education is very crucial here, and also what's important is to focus on the bigotry in our own communities. Not just against, I mean, I could come here and talk about anti-Semitism, anti-Muslimism, whatever you want to talk about it, but it's operating within our communities as well as between it, and it's operating on the right and the left. I've seen, when I dialogue and work with people on the left, the so-called left, the amount of anti-Muslim sentiments, whether it's in Europe or the United States, that can make your head reel, and these are the people who are supposedly the anti-war activists. When you see anti-war activists or peace activists supposedly supporting insurgency, there's so many problems going on because people are not really taking a cold, hard look at their own positions and being honest and really working out of empathy and love rather than just self-interest or a negative agenda. The only thing I'd add perhaps at this moment is as one of Reza's Jewish brothers perhaps, is that I wouldn't necessarily follow the Jewish community's example to the letter about support for Israel, because in some ways, one of the things that, if it becomes an uncritical support, and I would never think you're saying that, but I think Iraq is a very good example of how if Muslims come together to try to support a unified, democratic, indigenously democratic Iraq, we could run into problems, because the one thing I know from being there and from talking to people there and talking to people in the military and others, I don't think the U.S. has any plan to leave Iraq anytime in the near future, and we know that because no one in the U.S. government government will say when, if ever, we will leave, and I saw the bases that were being built there that we have no plans to dismantle. Yet, most Iraqis, and I dare say 95% of Iraqis who aren't Kurdish, want America to leave at the soonest possible moment. And when you look at the fact that we can't say we're going to leave, if you look at the oil aspect, if you look at some of these things, the Muslim community coming together still might find itself at odds with the American government. And what made the Jewish community work is that only that happened when Israel's strategic position in the region became very useful to America. So the two things coalesced, but perhaps not in a way that most supported peace. So it might be a little harder to do with Iraq than it was for Israel.
Thank you. Would you like to Ms. Romanowski?
I think I'll defer the discussions on policy to later, but I will make one, I think, disagreement with my colleague Reza here, and to say that I do think that public diplomacy has two components, and one is the ability to be able to explain what U.S. policy is. After all, the more opportunity you have to explain your country's policy, how it got there, why it got there, and other views around it, I think it again demonstrates the strength of the United States and our own democratic process. So I do think, and in my experience in engaging in the Middle East, the ability to explain our policy, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to win over everybody, but you do have to have the opportunity to explain it and explain it over again and in formal and informal ways. And I do think the other piece of it is very much the ability to share with others what we stand for and how we do things in this country, because it is a very vibrant and a very good example of democracy.
Thank you. We're going to take these three questions. We'll go to Reza Aslan after that.
Salam.
Hold on to the microphone. No, Zalef.
It's a great opportunity to have Undersecretary Romanowski at our mission. I really appreciate this.
I can hear you.
I am a physician and also an imam of a mosque. And it breaks my heart to see every day Israelis and Palestinians be killed. The point that is totally missed is that Muslims identify themselves with Palestinians. And unless the plight of Palestinians is settled in an humane way, I don't think all our efforts, all diplomacy would help. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. I was wondering, from the perspective of emerging Muslim public policy professionals, if you think it's more effective for us to join these already huge institutions such as the State Department or other high-profile think tanks, or is it better to form our own institutions exclusively Muslim to form these U.S.-world relations?
Thank you. We'll go to the last two. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. I am going to start with just quoting a few of the things that I got from the speakers today. Mark LeVine said that one of the things that we need to do is we have to have a commitment to activism and social justice. Ms. Romanowski said that we need to foster a community of interests and shared values. And Mr. Aslan said that in order to listen, we need to learn how to speak the language that we are trying to listen to. And as a young woman, in my college experience, oftentimes as Muslims, we got tripped up in foreign policy, and we got tripped up in what was happening in Israel and Palestine and Iraq, and a lot of issues that were happening outside of our community. And what happened was I'm from Chicago, so what happened was we were not serving the shelters in Uptown. We were not, participating in the literacy programs and for the Bosnian refugees. What are some ways that the mosques and the communities, the Muslim communities, can really get their young people motivated to do something that they can actually do?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Reza, if you could start off the three questions basically had to deal with the Palestinian issue as the unifying issue, not necessarily Iraq, because it seems to be a central issue in every part of the Muslim world. Then the second question was about institution building, whether to work with large groups or build your own institutions. And then the third question had to do more with domestic work, that you could do hands-on work as opposed to dealing with foreign policy. And the rest of the other panelists can also make their input as well.
Okay, I'll just speak very briefly about the issue with regard to Palestine and what is taking place there, particularly after the death of Yasser Arafat. From a purely policy standpoint, I think that the United States needs to recognize, and is doing so, I think, in better ways, though in many ways they've been forced to recognize the role that moderate religious opposition groups are going to have to play to promote any kind of lasting and stable democratic change in that region. I think that there is a tendency sometimes to shy away from certain oppositional groups because they have an Islamic or Islamist element to it. The UN Arab Development Report refers to this as a long-standing policy of what they refer to as the legitimacy of blackmail, and this is what they're referring to. For decades now, we have heard from various despots and autocrats in the region, our friends and allies, of course, Mubarak, Musharraf, Abdullah in Jordan, that their anti-democratic policies are necessary because if it weren't for them, then the theocrats would take over. So essentially, what do you want? Do you want an autocracy or do you want a theocracy? And of course, we have for 50 years, as Secretary Rice quite clearly admitted in Cairo, we have for 50 years chosen autocracy. The problem with that that blackmail legitimacy, well, there's two. I mean, first of all, the very idea that we need to ignore the role that these anti-democratic policies have played in creating militantism and extremism in that region in the first place. Jihadism was not created as a result of American foreign policy or as a response to American foreign policy. Jihadism was created in the dank and sadistic prisons of Nasser's Egypt. That's where it was born. So first of all, the premise of it is absurd. But secondly, I think that this notion that if somehow Muslims around the world were given a choice between a free and independent society in which they had an actual voice in their government, that they were ruled by the constitutionalism and the rule of law, or a theocratic fundamentalist society in which the Sharia essentially led every aspect of their lives, that somehow they would naturally choose the theocratic government because that's how Muslims are. It's absurd, it's offensive, it's ridiculous. So I think that the case of Palestine is the perfect example of what happens when you allow religious opposition groups a voice in the government. So let's talk about Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization. There's no question about that at all. However, if you look at the transformation that has taken place over the last year, in which Hamas has gradually begun to distance itself from its militant organization, the Qassam brigades, in which it has had to forego any notion of creating a Sharia state, because of course the vast majority of Palestinians do not want such a state. They want a democratic state. And most importantly, that Hamas has, in all of its electioneering, had to forego the very notion of a unified Palestinian state over all of historic Israel, and instead has been pushing in all of their stump speeches a two-state solution, is an indication of what happens when we allow these organizations, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, like the Islamic Action Front in Jordan, and like Hamas in Palestine, to become a part of the dialogue. When they are integrated into the democratic solution, then they have an opportunity to make their voices heard. As uncomfortable as it may sound for a lot of people, the only true difference between these moderate religious oppositional groups in the Middle East and the American evangelical groups in the United States is not in their aspirations. Both groups want to inject their own values, their own ideals into the society, but in the access that they have to the public forum and to public space. In the United States, we allow these religious groups to make themselves heard, and then it's up to the American citizens in a democracy to accept those values or to reject those values.
Okay,
in large parts of the Middle East, that is not the opportunity, and when that opportunity is taken away, it leads to extremism.
We're going to go to the last two questions. As far as the question on institution building, we support both working with the State Department, with federal agencies, with the government, as well as building Muslim institutions that would add and enrich American pluralism. As far as the domestic question involving domestic programs, we support both programs that deal, for example, in feeding the homeless. In fact, MPAC has been involved in feeding the homeless programs throughout the United States every Ramadan, along with other institutions, and we are involved in foreign policy as well. We feel that both domestic and foreign policy issues are of importance. Just one input from our organization: we feel also the term jihadism makes no sense. Jihad, we should reclaim the classical definition of jihad as meaning struggle and striving, and reject the definition that is used as holy war. Just that to us will serve everybody's interests. Two last questions, please.
Yes. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Haji Hassan, and I want to extend to the panel my deep appreciation for you taking the time to be here today, and thank you so much for that. I have a direct question to Sister Alina Romanowski, the Undersecretary. She extended to us a welcome to any suggestions we may have, and she was interested. It deeply grieves and bothers me about what I'm about to ask. It's in reference to America and how we implement our foreign policy on democracy. So often around the world, as well as most Americans here in America, believe that when it comes to our example, it has a lot to be desired, and this is an area that needs to be dramatically addressed. And I was wondering if you may have suggestions on how we do that, because they often say we should start at home before we go abroad.
Thank you.
And that's my question.
Thank you. Last question.
Yeah, my question is also for Ms. Alina. Season's greeting to you. Thank you for coming, and my specific request for you to explain, it's a very good idea to have culture program and exchange program, but we as Muslim community do not understand when visa is not issued to Cat Stephen, Yusuf Islam, or Tariq Ramadan, or many students are not given the opportunity to study in this country. So what kind of good feeling it will bring if our scholars are given hard time at the airport? When he was a music singer, he used to frequently fly to the United States without any difficulty. And we, the Muslim community, expressed the concern, but the State Department has not come forward and make any amendments.
Thank you. All right, if you could answer the questions and also give us your closing remarks, as we are running out of time and need to wrap up.
On the general question of walk the talk, I think that a couple of ways to answer that question. I think that, first of all, in our own democratic process, we've seen an awful lot of debate about what it means to support democracy, how do you go about doing nation building, and I think that our own democracy is not perfect. I think we all know that. We also need to be able to admit that, and then we also, but probably more importantly, is also to demonstrate that when certain things happen, there is accountability. There is a system, there is a rule of law, there is a system of government here in the United States that addresses those problems. I think that the fact, when I travel in the Middle East, there's no doubt there's an awful lot of discussion about our policies. I get the same question in the Middle East about how do you walk the talk, et cetera. I think the answer to that is we're not a perfect democracy, but when we do see things that happen, for example, at Abu Ghraib, we are outraged, and we do things about it. When we see problems, we just saw some pretty significant changes on the issue of the issue of torture that happened yesterday in Washington. For those of you who are staying abreast to that. So I do think that while we may not be perfect, I think that we probably have a much more open way of dealing with many of these issues and being able to demonstrate that our democracy is an open one full of discussion, which doesn't happen in the Middle East. That's one of the ways I would answer the question. On the issue of visas, I will say that, again, on that issue, there was quite a reaction after 9/11, and we have been working very hard to try and change many aspects of, in some cases, in most cases, not the visa policy, but certainly the speed with which visas are given, the fact that we can do whatever we need to do more effectively, more efficiently. We are also ensuring that we have additional resources and also a way of bringing people to the United States and at the border and passport control that's done in a different way. So we recognize that that has actually created a huge deficiency in being able to attract students here. So we are really working, and we're trying. You know, there are many ways to do this, and we recognize the problem. But I will say one thing. We did go back and we looked literally at the time it takes for visas to be issued for students, and now it's back to the way it was. But I will agree that, you know, all you need are 1 or 2 stories, again, about, you know, so-and-so couldn't get into the airport or, you know, see what happens, and you're almost back to it's very hard to dispel the 1 or 2 stories that do get out, but we do recognize that we're trying to do things differently, and we are working at the very highest levels between the State Department and Homeland Security to address some of the perceptions as well as the realities.
Thank you. Mark LeVine?
Yeah, just a few things. First of all, Palestine. We talk about Palestine, which is clearly an important issue given by the microphone's response to my saying the word. You know, Palestine is a symptom of a bigger disease. And I think Reza hinted at something that we all need to remember, that, you know, Palestine and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict helps support a larger regional system, most of whose leaders would not be very happy if the conflict actually was solved fairly and justly. And it's something that the U.S. and the systems leaders, the leaders of the region, have a lot invested in. So I think we need to look at it much more holistically. I think the key issue about looking at how we can work locally is crucial. You know, how many people here know the name of the Indian tribe on whose land you are probably illegally living, right? I mean, all of us in this room are settlers. All of us, in some sense, are not much better than the Jew from Brooklyn who goes to the West Bank or Gaza. What are we doing about it? And if we're not doing anything about it in the richest country in the world, what do we expect the person who moved to a settlement in Ariel or somewhere in the West Bank to do about it? So local, the people on whose backs this great country was built, they deserve our help too. So I think that's absolutely crucial. Finally, I'll just say about, you know, culture, and I think all of us agree that culture is important. A friend of mine a young man runs a refugee center in Bethlehem, a community center in Bethlehem in the Gaza refugee camp. And he brings in young people to keep them off the street, and he wants to teach them computers, and he wants to teach them the national dance. And when I heard the song they were dancing to, it struck me strange, and I said, isn't this song about hand grenades? He said, yeah, this is the only thing that'll get them in the door. So culture, to get them to dance about violence, is the only thing that they'll dance to and get out of the street because of the violence in the street. So if we want to change, right, it's not just about culture, it's not about diplomacy, it's about changing the reality of our own policies on the ground and forcing, with our power, other governments in the region to change their policies to actually support the ideals we say we want to support and build in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just spend my last couple of minutes, instead of talking about what we've already talked about, just making one more appeal to something that I think is so important. None of what we've talked about in this panel, and truly none of what we will talk about in this entire conference, will matter one bit if we as American Muslims do not learn to put aside the irrelevant differences amongst us with regard to ethnicity, with regard to nationality, with regard to sect and schisms and schools of law, and come together as one. Yes, there are things that divide us, but they are absolutely irrelevant when it comes to this larger issue of creating a truly sustaining and important and loud and dominant voice of American Islam that will drown out the voices of Puritanism and exclusivism that I think have become so loud and so obnoxious. And we, of course, representing one of the largest, one of the most diverse, one of the most highly educated, and one of the wealthiest communities in the entire United States, have to start remembering what binds us together rather than what sets us apart.
Thank you. We have just very quickly, if you could just wrap up.
I just wanted to try and answer the question from the young lady who was trying to figure out what she was going to do in her career. And I will make a very strong plug for public service. I started way back after graduate school, and I think working in the government and helping to shape your own government's policies and approaches and programs and